Welcome everyone to another Saturday morning here at the Art Clinic Online. We are so excited to have Ephraim Rubenstein back to talk to us, this time not about plein air or plein air and oil painting, but of a medium we haven't actually covered at the Art Clinic Online, which is pastels and soft pastels. It's a medium to me which is terribly frightening, in all honesty, mostly because I can't fathom having this quantity of pastels that you're seeing on the screen in my studio, and the cost of it in general, but I'm sure that we'll talk about that. But I just find it absolutely incredible to flipping through the slides that you'll see today, just the amount of time and thought process that goes into a drawing / painting of this magnitude. Ephraim and I have known each other for since 2000 actually, so 24 years, where he was my very first painting instructor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and he was also my senior thesis teacher upon graduation. And those were probably some of the most important 4 years of my life as an artist, to learn from one of the greatest teachers. And I still think of you as my mentor over, and I'm very proud to be your friend. But Ephraim also teaches or has taught at the Art Students League in New York City, and he lives in Ellicott City, and award-winning artist all over the world, and not just oil paint, not just pastels, but an incredible draftsman. And if you ever get a chance to see some of his wax resist drawings, maybe in a year or two, we'll have him come back and talk about those because they are also stunning. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend and mentor, Ephraim Rubenstein.
Thank you, Jordan. That's very sweet of you. And yeah, Jordan and some of his friends, that was a bumper crop year, I think, at period at Maryland Institute. There were some of really the best students I've ever taught there then. So it was really, really great for me also. But thank you also for inviting me back again to talk about pastels. I started with this slide of my setup, not to scare anybody, but to sort of make a point about pastels as opposed to oil painting. First, I might backtrack and try to answer the question, is pastel painting or drawing? And different people think about it very differently. I have friends up in New York who swear that it's painting. If you had to ask me, I think of it as drawing because it's dry and it's dealing with dust, and I sort of push it around, either with points or with my fingers, and it just feels like drawing to me. But you're dealing with full spectrum color. So it has the range of painting. So it's a very interesting question. I don't think it's one that needs to be answered. It's got qualities of both in it. But I think the main point is, this is my oil painting palette. You can see it's all here on my little palette right here. I have 15 colors or something like that. And if you compare that to what you're seeing in front of you, it's a huge difference. So with oil painting, what you're doing is you have your colors and you're spending your time mixing, right? With a palette knife or with a brush, hopefully with a palette knife, at least sometimes. Whereas in pastel work, you're hunting. You're trying to find the stick that you want. Many of the values are sort of pre-made for you. So you have to find the stick that's right for you. So it's a question of hunting rather than mixing, I would say, is the biggest difference. Another big difference, and I think probably what draws people to pastel, is that it's very matte. It's completely matte, whereas oil paint is very, very shiny, right? So there's no glare in pastel at all. And so the colors are brighter in some ways. They're a little bit flatter, but they're very bright, and you don't get into that problem of dark areas getting all glary on you. So sometimes for aesthetic reasons, like oil painting is kind of like eating roast beef all the time, whereas sometimes you want an omelet or a salad or something, and pastel has a lighter feel to it. I think I started pastels myself, actually for a much more prosaic reason. When my kids were little, and I was spending a fair amount of time running after them. With oil painting, if you don't have about 2 to 3 hours, you can't get anything done, because it's like 45 minutes to set up and 45 minutes to clean up. And so you're already into it an hour and a half and you haven't done anything. Whereas with pastels, you can go in for 10 minutes or 15 minutes and do something constructive and then just leave it. And there's nothing to clean up. There's nothing that dries on you while you're not watching, things like that. So I found it was a really good medium to work with if you had really small increments of time. And I came to love it for itself, but part of it was really the practical aspect of it that got me started. Now, again, not to scare you, this is only part of my pastel collection. I have a heck of a lot more than that. It's kind of like being E-Power Bigs at the big Wurlitzer organ, where you have 5 keyboards and pedals, and it feels like that when you're in the middle of working on this. But what you're going to find is, if you look at sort of the middle of the screen there, there's actually a garbage can, and I have a tray and a little box. For the pastel that I'm working on now, over time, I've sequestered certain colors that I'm using in that particular pastel. So I may start out with these hundreds of colors, but little by little, I get it down to about 40 or so, 50 maybe, that are more or less what I'm using, at least in most passages of the painting. And they all go sort of right next to me. So I'm not having to get up a lot. If you have a major jump, like if you're doing a landscape and there's a tree with some exotic flower in it and you need a fuchsia or something, I might have to get up and go to the cabinet and find something like that. But as with oil paint, what you're going to find is you go through your, tonal colors a lot faster. I mean, the visual field is basically dull, right? I mean, it's browns and grays and muted greens and things like that. And that's why we love flowers and vegetable stands and birds and things that have these bright splashes of color. I think most of us would find it kind of hard to live in a world of, totally saturated bright color all the time. But if you walk around, maybe later today, just look at how sort of muted and neutral the visual field basically is. And not just because it's raining this weekend, but it is in general. So anyway, you're going to go through 4 or 5 of those pastels for every one bright red pastel you might go through. Now, Jordan made an important point at first of saying that these are what we call soft pastels, which are really meant to differentiate themselves from oil pastels, okay? So oil pastels, to me, were somebody's good idea that really kind of went wrong. The feeling is that, well, if I could have oil paint, but in a stick, in my fingers, and it's no mess, no fuss, no bother, blah, blah, blah. Well, they're very hard to mix. They end up just being awful, I think. I haven't seen too many great results from oil pastels. It's possible there's people out there that are doing great work with oil pastels. I'm just not familiar with it, and I have not had a good experience with it. So soft pastels, again, are dry, they're dusty, and even though they're all called soft pastels, there's quite a range of hardnesses, okay? So you have some that are very, very hard. Like many people buy sets of new pastels. They're called new pastels by Prismacolor. Those are about the hardest pastels you can buy, and they feel like hard chalks. You can really sharpen them to very sharp points. And that really feels like drawing to me. Then there are some brands like Winsor & Newton, and I'm going back a ways, Grumbacher, which I'm not sure is even a brand anymore. Those are kind of in the middle. They're a little bit softer than new pastels. And then you have a whole bunch of pastels like Sennelier or Unison or pastels like that. They're fatter and chunkier, and they literally come off in your hands. They are all over you, just touching them. They're so soft. So when people ask, about all these different pastels that I have, there's quite a range of brands in there. And it's not so much for the colors. In other words, most brands cover the same colors. What I'm interested in are the hardnesses. Okay, so it probably makes sense if I tell you that it's best to start off with harder pastels because they lay down less dust and you can manipulate it more. If you take a really, really soft pastel like a Sennelier and start working with it, it clogs up the paper immediately. It lays down so much dust that it's very hard to, deal with, to get anything else in there. It'd be like putting down a huge slab of oil paint with your palette knife and then saying, okay, modulate that. And it's kind of hard. So you start out with the harder pastels. And by the way, the harder pastels, like the new pastels, are cheaper. So if you're going to use up, your pastels on the bottom, of the pile there, you might as well use the cheaper ones first and go through them. Pastels can get expensive. There are some brands that are, $4 or $5 for a stick, which may not seem like that much compared to a tube of oil paint, but you go through a stick pretty quickly in some situations. I'll show you an example of that. So anyway, that's about technically the major questions. There is an F word in pastel, which I'm not going to use online. Well, I will. It's fixative. Some people are really, really anti-fixative. Some people don't mind it at all. I'm kind of in the middle. I use it occasionally when I need to. The theory is, or the idea is, that pastel dust are tiny little particles, and each one of those particles has a facet that catches the light. And that's one of the things that makes pastels kind of sparkle. Well, if you spray a fixative coat on it, it's going to matte that all down, and you're going to lose that aspect of things. On the good side, one problem with pastels, and people lament this all the time, is that it's hard to get down in the darks in pastel, right? You think of most pastel drawings, they tend to be lighter and brighter keyed, and you have a harder time getting down into the darks. And then one of the arguments against fixative is that it darkens your pastel. So I'm thinking, well, maybe you could use that to your advantage. So in some areas where you really want to darken something, why not fix it lightly and bring it down a notch, and then you have that done for you. So I use fixative occasionally and in certain situations in the drawing. The problem is that pastels are fairly delicate. In other words, you have to, if you're going to show them, you have to frame them, under glass or plexiglass, and you have to have some kind of a mat with a lift. In other words, you don't want the dust from the pastel coming down on the border of your mat. So you want it going behind the mat. So you have a lift, things like that. So they need a certain amount of love and care after they're done. There also, I think, historically has always been a prejudice against works on paper. I've got to say that I think that, you know, artist drawings, watercolors, pastels, those were always seen as being inferior somehow to oil paintings because they didn't last as long. Well, they could last just as long if they're taken care of. They are very light sensitive, not as bad as watercolors, but if you leave a pastel exposed to the bright sunlight, it will dull the colors over time. So you have to, you know, take care of it, not to hang it someplace where it's getting bright sunlight right on it for years and years. I mean, the same technically is true of oil paintings, but it's a little bit less so. They're not quite as delicate. So anyway, all right. Well, why don't we look at the next slide. This is a pastel of one of my favorite models, Natalia Nata. And actually, I'm going to be doing a pastel workshop, right, Jordan, in October. And Natalia is going to come model for that. So I worked on this pastel over a fairly long period of time. And you can see just the edge of the pastels there that I was working with. You can see one thing that I've been doing in my work in later years is I'm leaving parts of the drawing sort of undone or in the drawing phase, or in other words, I'm very intrigued by how an image just emerges from the page. You have your surface, whether it's a painted canvas or a piece of paper in the case of pastels. And it's totally flat, you know, it's ruthlessly flat. And you can see the drawing marks where her hand is under her head. It's still left in the drawing phase. And you start to go up her arm and you're thinking, oh my God, that really looks like an arm with an elbow pointing out at you. But if you go back down, it's just pencil marks and it's just dust on a piece of paper. To me, that's so intriguing that you can get form to come out of that ruthless flatness. Also, you can see on the two sides, on the right and left sides, you see these little marks of different chalks. When I pick up a chalk, I have a pretty good idea how dark or light or warm or cool it is, but because I'm working on a piece of toned paper that has a medium value and it's off to the sort of brown gray, I don't know exactly what that color is going to look like on that brown color, okay? So I'll make a mark on the side there just to kind of test it out. And sometimes you're quite surprised that the color you picked is actually much lighter or darker than you thought it was, or not quite as warm or whatever. So then you can adjust and go back into your drawing with the correct chalk. And there's something in this also that I decided to leave in the drawing because I love the sense of including people in the process of making the drawing. This is how it's done and why cover your tracks. You know, for most of my life, I painted everything right out to the edges, and I was sure that the illusion should be the most important thing. And then I remember I had some years where when I was living in New York, I had some students who worked for the Metropolitan Opera, and I was able to go to some rehearsals. And I remember being almost more intrigued by the rehearsals than I was by the ultimate performance, because I loved it where the conductor would say, stop, stop, stop. No, don't do it that way. Do it this way. And you'd see them make an adjustment. And I thought that that was so fascinating, that I was being taken backstage, as it were, and seeing how it's all created. And I thought that there's a thrill to that also. So anyway, so you may see that in some of these pieces. All right, next. Yeah, so here's the finished piece, and eventually it will go to the framer like this. The painting, as you can see, drawing is it's 40 by 60. So it's not quite life size, but it's getting close to it. It's about 2/3 life size. So when you encounter this thing, you really feel like you're in the presence of living flesh. All right, next. Here's a detail. As you'll see in October, Natalia has extraordinarily beautiful tattoos, and I only took advantage of some of them coming around from her back onto her shoulder and onto her arm in this particular piece. Let's look at the next one. Okay, here's a detail of her foot, and I spend every bit as amount of time on a small toe as I do on anything else. And one thing that you can see here that's really interesting is a sort of a scumble, which is the same in oil painting as it is in pastels. And you can see sort of right before you get to the toes, there's that flat plane of the foot. And there's basically some slightly darker notes, and then some lighter pastel is scumbled across the top, basically along the tendons, okay? But you're seeing the sort of dark through the light, and it's doing this, it's flickering, and it's making this beautiful kind of texture in there. And that's something that you can do in oil, but you have to kind of work at it. In pastel, it happens almost automatically. And I'm using a reasonably smooth paper. If you used a very rough paper, you could get even more of that. And by the way, with papers, there's Canson Matin is a perfectly fine paper to use for pastel. It comes in zillions of colors. Pretty much any kind of paper with some sort of a surface on it, a laid surface, is fine, just so it has something that catches the dust. They make, manufacturers make sanded papers where there's literally, it's like working on a piece of sandpaper, and it grips the pastel right off of your stick. You can feel it come right off and cling to the paper. So you need a paper that's going to hold on to the dust. And if you're working in layers and layers and layers, which I don't, I have some layers, but not tons. If you're working in lots of layers, you need a pretty coarse paper because you need something that can house all of that dust, right? So a piece of paper both files off the dust, but it's got to house the dust at the same time, if that makes sense. It's a file and a house, a piece of paper, as is a canvas, okay? So that's something to think about when you're selecting papers. All right, and by the way, can we go back for 1 second? You can see on the bottom of her upper leg, you can see that warm tone from the drapery is kicking back up into the bottom of her leg there. So, I'm constantly looking for color as it vibrates around, whether it's primary light or secondary light, reflected light, whatever. All right, next. This is another piece that I did of Natalia, and you can get a great sense of how beautiful those tattoos are on her arms. And she just settled down into this chair in my living room and was, just so beautifully ensconced in this chair with her head back and the light coming in from one of the living room windows. It was just a wonderful thing. And again, it takes some time to figure out, what you're going to put in and what you're going to leave. It's not necessarily something that I plan ahead of time. It happens as I'm going along with the drawing. I've had this experience, and I don't know if any of you have had it, but you'll be working on a painting or a drawing, and at a certain point, you say, oh, that looks great, just like that, even though it's not finished. It looks great, but you're afraid to leave it that way. You feel some compunction to quote unquote finish it. And I always felt that compunction. and all of a sudden I stopped because I realized, okay, yeah, I could paint the top of that chair there, the left corner of the chair, but would it make it a better painting if I did that? Actually, now it's kind of really intriguing to see how flat that whole area is, and how the darks kind of go on either side of it and make a pathway for the light to go through there. I find it really fascinating. So let's just say I had to give myself permission at first to leave some of these things undone. All right, let's look at the next one. All right, so here's a piece I did, and in this case, I was able to, I took slides of it at certain intervals as I was going along, so I could really show you how I developed a piece. Now, this is an example of that crimson cloth that she's on, which is so beautiful. I probably went through 5 sticks of a particular color in doing that. Now, there are variations in there, some lighter, some darker, some a little bit rosier, some more purpley, but the base color is one particular stick. And so early on, I realized I was going to run through that very quickly. And so I, got on Jerry's or whatever and ordered some single stock sticks of it. Okay, so keep this finished piece in your mind as we start to work through how this thing was done. All right, let's look at the first one. Okay, so this is a couple of sessions into it, and you'll see there's a pencil drawing, which is an outline or what I consider to be a map. I refer to this as the mapping stage of the drawing because it's a map because it tells me where I'm going to go. It tells me where the colors are going to go down. Okay. So the whole thing starts out as just a pencil outline, a map of this figure. And then I started right in on the portrait. Not all nudes feature the portrait aspect so strongly. In this case, the model was looking right at me, and I just loved the intensity of that. So I started right in with her head. I think the next one is a close-up. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So I spent quite a lot of time in here working out the portrait aspect of this. But very early on, I wanted to get some of that crimson in so I could see the how that crimson worked against the figure. In other words, I'm always going for differences. When you're starting a piece, you don't want to work all in one area because it doesn't tell you anything. Until you get some of your darkest darks and your lightest lights and your warmest warms and your coolest cools, until you have those things, you haven't worked out the parameter of the piece. How light or dark or warm or cool it's going to be. So you want to get to those things early on. So I had that crimson in pretty quickly early on. And of course, it takes a while to work out the portrait aspect of something. If you're really careful about getting a likeness and getting the look that you want on the face. So that's where I spent a fair amount of time. Also, I think I learned over the years, when I was younger, if there was a part of the painting or drawing that scared me, like the portrait of this woman, I'd leave it till the end. And then I realized the entire time I was working on the rest of the drawing, I was cowering about, was I going to be able to do the head or was I going to mess it up? So at some point in my life, I realized, like Shakespeare said, a coward dies 1,000 deaths, a hero dies but once. So go in and do the part that's concerning you and get it done with and conquer it. And then the rest of the piece is going to be a lot more enjoyable. And so it worked out well in that case. All right, let's look at the next one. So then early on, it then became important to get some of the background note in, right? The wall that's behind the couch and the crimson cloth. And I think that's actually, you can see there's quite a difference in these different slides about what that color is of that cloth. This is pretty close to what it was. It's a burgundy crimson color. And what blows me away about this particular slide is you see the corner of the room, right? Behind the couch, there's the light wall and the darker wall next to it. It's amazing how you look at those two gray blues next to each other and you could swear there's a surface that's folded, you know, that's going in. And it's really just the same flat piece of paper with two different tones on it, but it reads like space, amazingly reads like space. And that's the thing that's, you know, thrilled me when I was first starting and thrills me to this day, that you can carve space into a flat surface that way. So getting that blue in, vibrating next to the crimson, and then both of those against the you know, lighter, pinker notes of the flesh tone were very, very important. They set the key for the whole piece. All right, next. And here's what the whole page looked like. Now, I did something that I will not do again, which is that when I started this piece, you know, the model was there, ready to go. I decided what I wanted to do. I did not have a big piece of paper, which in this case, you'd have to get off a roll or something like that. So I taped 4 pieces of paper together. And I did not do a great job of it. I did an okay job of it. Eventually, when the piece was done, it went to the framer and it came back. And then about 4 months later, the tape started to separate and the paper started to buckle and the whole thing started to come apart. And I had to pay to get the framer to go in and undo it all. And we, you know, we retaped this time properly all the paper together. So there is a way to tape paper. You know, you want a really fine archival paper tape, one that's not going to show ridges when you go over it. Remember, you're rubbing, it's like doing a brass rubbing on a gravestone. You're picking up anything, which is why you have to have a really good drawing board, something that doesn't have any, you know, indentations or pocks or scrapes or marks on it, because it's going to pick it up as you're rubbing with your chalk. So anyway, at certain points in this drawing, you will see the creases of this paper. And I said, you know what? That's fine. That's also part of how this drawing came into being. It just happened that way. So we'll live with it. All right, next. So you can see I've moved up the hands, right? And gotten into the crimson drapery on the other side of her now. So the hands after the head, all right, the next thing that you really worry about. You know, traditionally, portrait painters, even going back to the Renaissance, would charge a certain amount for a face, a certain amount for a bust, a certain amount for a 3/4, a certain amount for a 3/4 with one hand, and more for a 3/4 with two hands, right? Because two hands were worth a head in terms of time and money. So, you know, there's no money involved in this case, but the point is that hands are very difficult also and very expressive of particular people. So that was something that I was glad to sort of get done early on in this process. All right, next.
From I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you tell us what paper you're using here, please?
Yeah, it's the Casson Maitan. Mitienes, Maitan. Yeah. And I use actually, the Maitan paper has a smooth side and a rough side. I find the rough side really obnoxious. It looks like you're drawing on a golf ball. There are these just tiny little like circular divots. I don't know how they came up with that press, but I don't really like that. So I use the smoother side. And since I work fairly thinly with pastels, I don't worry about having to have a super, a paper with a super high grit to it or something like that. Yeah, so the smooth side of the Casson. Yeah. All right, so I'm sort of working out the crimson as I'm working down the figure in this case. And you can see, once you get into the chest and the belly, you're in areas of the body that don't get the sun, right? So they're much lighter and paler. I mean, everybody's arms and face are darker than their midriff, usually, unless, you have a job that takes you outside in the sun. And you want to pay attention to that sort of thing, because I think it points to a certain vulnerability that we all have, right? Our chests, our torsos are not exposed to the sun, and so we feel a certain privacy about them. Yeah. All right, next. So now this is a very important step in the drawing. Obviously, you can see immediately how important it is, because we're getting that, brown of the sofa in, and that's the next big note in this composition. Let's say you have those tawny notes of the sofa, the crimson of the drapery, and the cool blue-gray of the wall, and the pink of her body. Those four things vibrating together are really what make this piece what it is. And so I had to get to it as quickly as I could. It was, in a place that I sort of needed to work my way down to. Now, you could say, why couldn't on the second day I just go over there and put some of that in? The problem is, because it's not attached to anything else. It just kind of sits there like an island, and you don't know, your eye doesn't know how to relate it to the other colors across the expanse of the paper. So in my way of working, really the color values need to be contiguous in order to make sense. They become building blocks, and I know that they're right. If I throw something in all the way on the other side of the paper, I probably am 90% sure it's right, but I'm not totally sure. Now, there might be a situation where I just want to throw something in over there just to have it, just to be looking at it, and taking it into account as I'm working on a piece. But that's an exception rather than the rule. So anyway, so this is a really important stage in the painting drawing, because it's introducing that fourth big element. All right, next. And just going back to giving you always relating it to the larger scale. You can see this was a really difficult moment when I hit the iliac crest of the pelvis there, which is so light, right? And when it was first in with nothing else, I kept thinking, God, that's popping. Wow. But I kept looking at her going, it is that light, so I'm just going to put it in and see if it resolves itself as I connect it to the other color values in the legs. Yeah.
Ephraim, could I ask you, how many sessions up to here would you estimate you had used with the model, or perhaps from photos as well?
I would say, well, there were probably about 3 on the drawing, just the pencil drawing, probably 4 or 5 on the portrait, another 2 or 3 on the hands, and then, so what are we up to, a dozen? Yeah, maybe getting close to 20 at this point. Yeah.
Thank you. That's amazing.
All right, let's look at the next one. Okay, so as I'm sort of working my way down, that that highlight on the iliac crest is resolving itself in, particularly as I get that knee out in front of it. Now, I want you to look at this really carefully because it's a leap of faith. In other words, you look at the back thigh, right, that's against the couch, and it's got this kind of creamy, yellowy kind of tonality to it. Whereas the leg, the knee that's coming out in front of us, which is not in the direct light, but in the half light, and it's also being exposed to all of that reflected light from the crimson drapery. It takes on this incredible purpley kind of tone to it. And the question is, are you going to be able to live with that? You know, the truth of that? Or are you going to say, I need to make it all more or less the same, you know? And I always try to resist that because different parts of the body read really differently, depending on, you know, the angle that you're seeing them, depending on, again, their history of either being out in the sun or not being out in the sun, or things like that, the way a person's lived their life. It tells you so much about them. There's not a grand uniformity. I mean, there was a time when paint manufacturers, I don't know if any of you, I don't think they do it anymore. I hope they don't. But like Winsor & Newton used to make a series of paints called flesh tone number 1, flesh tone number 2, flesh tone number 3. I kid you not. It didn't look like any flesh tone that a human being has ever had. It looked like the flesh tone of a Barbie, basically. You know, it wasn't even a good look at Caucasian flesh tone, no less anyone else's flesh tone. So you don't want to get into that mindset where you say, oh, flesh tone is, you know, has to be this or it has to be that. You need to look at it at every moment and say, what is it here? You know, because it depends on what's next to it and how it's angled in relation to the light and things like that. Okay, so you'll see this will resolve itself as I work my way through the drawing. But I realized looking at this slide that it looks odd. And I realized that I had a certain amount of trepidation when it first went down. I mean, I knew I would get it to work, but I realized, you know, someone who was not experienced with this would find that very hard to live with that. They'd put it down and they'd be tempted to revise it. And what I would say is don't revise it. If you looked at it and you studied it and that's what you saw, put it down and leave it be. All right, let's keep going. There's just a detail of that knee. All right, let's look at the next one. And then I've worked my way. In this case, I decided I could kind of extrapolate what the flesh tone of the leg was going to look like. I would get more information if I worked my way down the sofa and the drapery. So I did that in this case. And then next. There we go. And then I worked my way through there. And that's how I decided to leave it, because I love that sort of roller coaster of the bottom of the drapery there as it hangs down. And then there you have the ascending on the gray wall and the descending on the drapery at the bottom. And again, this is not something that I plan as I work on pieces. I see them at different stages, and I go through a really difficult process of saying, should I leave it like this, or should I do a little, does it need a little more here? And what I do is I do what, you know, I learn from writers. All the writers that I know tell me that the best way to proofread something you've written is to put it in a drawer for 6 weeks and, you know, don't look at it, and take it out when you're not like right on top of it and look at it again. And so I would do that. I would put it away for a while, work on something else, and then I would take it out and look at it, and I'd get an immediate feeling. And then I might leave it in a conspicuous place in my house, and, you know, someplace where I had to walk by it 4 or 5 times a day. And I'd look at it, and if I keep having this nagging little feeling like, needs a little more here, then I would do it. If I could walk by it you know, for a month, and it didn't bother me anymore, then I realized I was in a good place with it. So this is really, this aspect of it, where to leave things, is definitely art. It is not science. It's a question of feel. And the bottom line is, you could do 5 different pieces that you left in 5 different positions, and they all might be wonderful. You know, this is definitely the road not taken. Okay, so you can make a lot of different things work. Yeah. All right, let's look at the next one. We'll go on to a portrait. I don't know, Jordan, do you remember Aiken? She was in your class at Micah.
Yeah, I remember her.
Yeah.
I remember
So
this portrait from then too.
yeah, so Aiken posed for me then. She was Turkish and had this just beautiful, you know, ringlets, black, jet black ringlets. And she was really interested in pastels. So I said, okay, why don't you pose and you can see how I work on this. So this was a piece that I did of her at around that time. Yeah. All right, next. This is a portrait of a dear old friend of mine, Chris Beals. He is, I mean, he's still alive, but he's no longer working. He was a psychiatrist in New York and worked for Columbia PNS, and spent his life caring for indigent Hispanic families that had children with schizophrenia and things like that. He had a really tough job, and he was a very dear friend of mine. He took care of my mother when she was dying, and I had this feeling that he's got this like Old Testament head, you know, like he's managed to just absorb all of the surahs that he was hearing into his forehead, you know, and these beautiful hands as he would listen to what people had to say. It was such a powerful, thoughtful head. And he had these wonderful eyebrows that kind of framed his eyes in this really dramatic way. So I did maybe 5 or 6 portraits of Chris. He is also an artist himself. So was, you know, very happy to pose so he could watch how things were developing. He did some wonderful figure pieces himself. Let's look at the next one, which is another one I did of Chris. In this case, what I did was I wanted to emphasize his role as a listener. So I put his ear dead center in the composition. And usually in portraits, you know, you illuminate the features. Well, I did the opposite. I put all of his features in the shadow, because he's not supposed to, it's not about him, right? It's about listening to someone else. So I obscured his features, put them in the shadow, and put his ear front and center, as it were. Yeah. It's a very moody piece. And along with his eyebrows, he had this wonderful dramatic curl of hair that went over his forehead. Yeah. I spent a lot of time on these pieces. Luckily, some of it I could do when he wasn't there, like really trying to get the feeling of the hair in the beard. That's something that once I got the major, you know, how light, how dark going on there, I could work in the sort of individual tufts of hair and things like that. I could do that on my own. Same with the mustache or the eyebrows. So luckily some of this stuff I could do on my own, but he put in some hard time in the modeling chair for this one.
Would you work from photos at times?
Generally not with him. You know, he was willing to pose. With the next one, let's look at the next one of my father. My father was a, very busy lawyer his whole life. Up until the day he died, he was working on cases. So he had relatively little time to pose. So in this case, I did work from photographs. Yep. This is my father as Yahweh, as some of my friends like to call it. He's, very imposing figure, very powerful head again. And it just takes a lot of time to work through all of those areas. If you look at sort of the bags underneath the eyes going along the cheekbones, they have very particular forms and they have wrinkles and all sorts of things attached to them that you just have to work through very carefully. I found when I get into something like that, where I need to do wrinkles or tiny little linear elements, that I end up using pastel pencils. Okay, so you can buy pastels in pencil format. And what that is basically it's the same pastel dust as they use in the sticks, but it has added to it much more clay and sometimes a little bit of wax to make it glide a little bit. So you can actually sharpen those things in a pencil sharpener, and that's very, very helpful in situations like this. I did a fair amount of this with new pastels, just because I needed a harder instrument to get into these tiny places. With a new pastel, you can sharpen that. It's kind of ugly. You lose a lot of the dust. I mean, I when I'm sharpening a new pastel, I sharpen it into the lid of a jar or something, so I don't waste the dust. I can put some of the dust on with my fingers if I need to. But you go through a lot of it getting to that point, whereas in a pastel pencil, it's not the same. All right. So yeah, let's go on.
I had a quick question, Ephraim. Would you mind talking a little bit about hard versus soft edges, about when you choose to mix a pastel or just let the pastel kind of sit without it blending it into the things around it?
Sure. I mean, we can stay right on my father for a while. So if you notice, like his eyes, obviously, I want you to go to his eyes and his nose. The tip of his nose is the closest thing to you. Coming out into space. So there's a certain clarity there. Whereas if you look on the left side of his head, the hair is much softer. In other words, I've blended that in, and then the dark side of his hair on the right is even softer. So things that you want to go back into space, we know that hard edges come forward and soft edges tend to recede. So you can do that by either taking your finger and just rubbing the two things together, the hair node and the background node, just rub, and it makes a very soft edge. You can do it with a stump. You can do it with a Q-tip, anything that'll allow you to just kind of mishmash things. If you're using your fingers, I use my fingers, just make sure that you always wash your hands before you work so you don't have oil or grease. If you have, a greasy spot, like you just had an English muffin on the break and you're going to put a greasy print down on the drawing. So you want to make sure your hands are clean. But yeah, so I will sometimes you can just scumble over, like I was saying, a note, and that pushes back the thing that was in front of it. So there are many ways to alter how hard and soft, and therefore how near and far different things are. All right, next. So we grew some beautiful stargazer lilies, and I did a whole series of pastels of them. They just had this extraordinary color inside them. Those are notes I don't, often get to when you're doing portraits or landscapes. Like I said, that's why we love flowers and vegetable stands, because they provide us this opportunity to see so much bright local color. And you can see in the the bud that's behind, with the exception of that one petal that's towards us, the rest of it's really been taken down. The edges have been taken down, so it goes back. And you can see as I sort of, if you look at the green leaves, the one right under the bud, the blossom, is pretty clear. But as you start to go down the stem, the silhouette of the leaves gets softer and softer. In other words, I'd rub that into the background gray, so it tended to sort of disappear from your view. Whereas the green leaf that's right above the blossom is not only darker, but it has sharper edges, so it catches your eye. Another thing that brings you to the blossom is not just the color, but the fact that the lightest light and the darkest dark in the drawing are right there. So those are things you can plot as you go. In other words, some of it you take from the nature, from the subject. On the other hand, there's bright colors sort of everywhere on a stalk of lilies like this. You have to decide which ones you want the viewer to look at, and so you can say, okay, this is the most important thing, and I'll keep these things brighter, and I'll keep the edges harder, and these aspects are less important, so I'll put in, tend to do darker colors, and I'll soften the edges and make them go away. All right, next. Yeah, here's another one of the lilies. And I just love this blue bottle. It just blew me away I didn't think I could get a oil paint that had that kind of intensity to it. It's very hard to see in a slide, but if you saw this pastel in actuality, that blue is just mesmerizing. It's like a pure cobalt powder. It's not mixed with anything else, so it's amazing to look at. And in this case, you can see, one of the hardest things about this was the shadows that the blossoms are very gently casting on the wall. They were very, very delicate and very hard to really get right. Sometimes I overdid them and they were too prominent. And so I would take them out or take them down, and then they'd be too mushy. So I'd come back and work in. And that's a great thing of pastel. You can keep working back into it. Another reason why sometimes it's good to use fixative. If you've done something 3-4 times and you kind of clogged up the works and there's so much dust on the paper, you can't add anything to it, you can fix it and stabilize it. It creates a stable layer that you can then go back into. All right, next. I did several of this beautiful pewter pitcher with white roses. And, white roses are anything but white. There are all these beautiful blue grays and yellows and ochres and all kinds of other colors in there. I took advantage of this fallen petal, and it didn't land right there. I moved it there. Yes, I did. And you can see it's got a beautiful reflection of it in the belly of the pitcher, along with the window, right? That's casting light on it. All right, next, there's another version of this. Yeah, and this is just a little bit different, just the presence of that brownish gray, which is a little more prominent in this one. Also, the viewpoint's up a little higher, so I'm looking down on it a little bit more. That gives you a slightly different feeling. And this is a good example of what Jordan was talking about on the line from the end of the table to the backdrop. You can see particularly on the left how really soft that edge is. It's practically not even there, because I really want that just to be hinted at and to go away and for the vase to come forward. All right, next. Then I did a couple of pastels of my dear dog Juno, who died a couple of years ago, and I really missed her terribly. And so I did these drawings of her. She ensconced herself in the chair in my bedroom, and that's kind of where she lived. So I was just so used to seeing her there all the time. that I needed an image of her in that chair. So I worked on this over a period of time. I actually did 2 versions of this. I think there's another one, Jordan. Yeah, here's the second one. The Juno was actually part my daughter's dog and my dog. We shared her. She lived in both houses. So I gave the first drawing to her because she was disconsolate, and I kept the second drawing because I was disconsolate. So, but I think you can see, I mean, look, there are 2 kinds of people in the world. There are people who get it about dogs, and there are people who don't get it about dogs, who think dogs are annoying. Well, if you're in the first group, then you would understand, this is an animal that had a soul, and I could feel it in her portrait, and I wanted to convey that. So anyway, all right, let's keep going. I'm probably running over time. Am I okay, Jordan?
You're a bit over, but we can kind of go a little quicker towards the
Okay,
end.
let's go quicker. I went to Sicily last year, and I was just blown away by the Greek temples there. And so I did all sorts of pastels of this one is actually of Selinunte, the temple where with the wax resist of yours, Jordan. Same temple, this time in color. And there was something, again, about leaving parts of this undone, which had to do with, of course, the fragmentary quality of Greek ruins, right? They don't come to us whole. They come to us in bits and pieces. So it made sense to leave these things undone. Okay, next. Here's a detail. When you looked at the first one, it could look like a painting, but when you look at this, you can see why I think of pastels as drawings, because there's a linear, you see the sort of scratch marks, you can feel the dryness and the dust. This is how I built up the layer of the stones, but look at how complex that is. Some of those stones up there have so many different colors in them, grays and oranges and ochres. And they all come together to make this beautiful kind of fabric of what you're seeing. All right, next. Here's another great big one of Selinunte, looking down the main corridor. And in this case, you get to see some of the surrounding landscape through the columns. All right, next. Here's a detail. Again, so you can kind of see, you can see right at the bottom, there's some little grasses and tiny little flowers that are growing. You can get into little details in places with pastel pencils if you want them. Yep. All right, next. And then this is my setup. This is where I am actually right now. If you kind of look over there, you can see I'm actually a little further along on this piece now. Where did I go? Here we go. Okay. So here's that painting now as it's evolving. And anyway, so that's a sort of just general introduction to pastels, but how I use pastels. I use pastels the way I do because I was not trained in pastels. I was trained in oil painting, and so I started to use it more like oil painting. I figure I can mix. I mixed on the paper, not on a palette. But, hardcore pastel guys, they don't like to mix. They like to layer. They don't mix at all. So, you get what you want. And that's what I did. So anyway,
Thank you so much. It was amazing and fabulous, and I really appreciate the kind of the in progress images of the model and kind of seeing how you approach it over multiple periods of time. And I imagine I could definitely see the relationship between color spot painting and how you are approaching pastel. It really doesn't feel that different to me. And for those of you who are a little unfamiliar with what we're talking about, I would encourage you to go see the recording of Ephraim's previous talk with the Art Clinic online, where he dives into color spot painting. But I find it really kind of reassuring, actually, that you don't have to learn a whole new system to create with pastels if you're already familiar with, with oil painting. It seems like there's a lot of commonality between the two.
Yep, absolutely. Plus, in oil painting, if you're painting all over at once, that's fine because it dries and you can get into it. But with pastels, if you're painting all over at once, like where do you put your hand down? It's all dust everywhere. It's a mess, so you have to plot out your moves a little bit. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit? Do you know much about the toxicity of the dust, and are they still using heavy metals in a lot of the sticks like Sinalia, for instance?
Well, obviously they don't use any lead whites. You're only getting titanium or zinc white. It is possible that in the, some of the reds, you might be, they don't say cadmium on them, but I don't know. I haven't really explored what's in them. I don't know the answer to that, except that all of them say it's got a, non-toxic, safe, sticker on them. Whether you can believe that or not, I'm trying to look at some of these here and see if the European ones do. But that's something you can get an MSDS sheet from the manufacturer and ask about that. I know people who are very concerned about that, and they probably should be. Like I say, I don't generate tons of dust. So, my dust tends to go down, and at the end of the day, I take a dust buster and I get it up. But it might be something that if you're worried about it, you would wear a mask when you work. And you would just clean up after yourself pretty well and have good ventilation in the room. Obviously, you don't want to be blowing right on your, because you don't want the dust to blow away, but have the air circulating in your room. Yeah, no, it's a perfectly reasonable question.
When you use fixative, what fixative do you use?
Okay, yeah, there's only one fixative that I use, only one, Lascaux, like the cave, LAS. Yes. Here we go. Lascaux, yeah. This is the only fixative I would use. It's like you haven't put anything down. It's as close to non-existent as possible. It's, $35 a can, so it's very expensive, but, I can fix 10 drawings with this. So it's, $3 a drawing at that point. It's worth it. But I find that if you use, some of the other ones, the Grumbacher, or I forget some of the other names, you put it down and it really darkens it, or it looks gunky all of a sudden. This doesn't look like you did anything. So anyway, that's my recommendation for fixative. And with fixatives, right, you have to do that outside. You really cannot do that in your studio. I mean, we at the league, we put in a booth, a spray booth, that was supposed to, take it right up. And even the spray booth wasn't really good enough, So I take it out on my back porch and I spray it. If you live in an apartment building, you're going to have to go outside and find a spot where no one's going to yell at you and spray it. But this really is, there's all sorts of hydrochemicals in here that it's not good for you. So do it outside. Yeah. Hydrocarbons, sorry.
And I wonder, we're kind of over, but on time. But if anyone has any other questions for Ephraim, now's the time. I also want to remind everyone that Ephraim will be at the Stone Tower Studio for the month of October, where you can come and see some of these pastel works in person. And then he'll be doing a weekend workshop through the Glen Park Partnership here at the studio. So, if you want to learn pastels from one of the best, that there is an opportunity for that.
Yeah, please come in October.
Yeah.
Okay. Pastels are very new to me. This is not what I've ever done. I inherited Sennelier and Rembrandt from my aunt who passed away 2 weeks ago. She was an artist in upstate New York with gallery affiliation, and she used them a lot. And they were offered to me, and I said yes. So some technical questions. You talk about archival paper tape. What would you recommend? Do you use an eraser? And in which case, which one might you recommend for what you do, or do you not? Questions about color of paper. I mean, I'm used to working on white and then figuring out what to do, but pastel paper is different.
Yeah, okay, so there's a bunch of questions there. With the paper tape, there's a company called Linco, Linco, and they make all kinds of tapes and archival materials, and get something that's called paper tape. And it literally is like the thinnest piece of rice paper with a little bit of gum on it that you can imagine. So, but that's only if you're taping pieces of paper together to make a bigger piece. Now, there are some companies that make large pieces of pastel paper. I mean, not huge, but like 40 by 50. That's a pretty decent. Yeah, that's big enough for most cases. So you could try buying some of those. You can use printmaking paper. Certain kinds of printmaking paper come in oversized. Anyway, as far as your two sets, well, first of all, I'm sorry about your aunt.
She was 99.
Okay, I'm glad about your aunt. I'm glad you got the pastels too. The Rembrandt will be the harder of those two, the Sennelier or the softer. So I would start out trying to work with the Rembrandt and see if you like them. You'll have more control over them. The Sennelier are very soft and very messy.
Yeah, well, that was good. I mean, even things as simple as easels or surfaces to work on. You're talking about, you talked about you wanting to have, a smooth surface behind so that you get nothing that comes onto the paper. This is all so new to me. It's both a challenge and an inspiration. And
okay, good. Well, you need a good drawing board. You need a good drawing board. Go to Home Depot and get a piece of masonite, tempered masonite, in whatever size that you want. They'll cut it down for you. I don't know, what size your drawing table is or however you draw, but figure out what your basic size is going to be. I start with the paper size and then make sure I have an inch or so extra, and I'll get a piece of masonite cut. Yeah, and masonite is very good because it's very smooth, it's very flat, and it's light. If you had a big birch board or something, it would just
it's okay. So I saw you adhered using paper clips, but there's something that's protecting your paper from those.
Yeah. Yeah. So so when I'm clipping the drawing down, I use just a regular old bull clip, like at Staples or whatever. And by the way, I get so many of my art supply store stuff at Home Depot or Staples, Lowe's. The second they call it art supplies, they charge more for it. Okay. Then I just have a piece of paper that I've folded over a couple of times, a piece of rag paper, and I just put it down first and then clip it on this. You can use a little piece of foam core board, a little piece of mat board, anything, because you don't want the clip to make marks in the paper. At least I don't. I mean, I probably should as part of the process, right? I mean, for me, another really eye-opener was I went to see this Andrew Wyeth drawing exhibition, and there was this gorgeous, gorgeous head he did of this old man. And on the side of the drawing, I swear there was the ring of a coffee cup. And I was like, holy shit. I mean, that's Wyeth, so yeah. Anyway, but I like to avoid getting those clip marks. Yeah, so that's why I do that. All right. Yep.
And there was one question in the chat from Barbara that I forgot to ask earlier. Is I think it related more to models, but in general, with things you were observing, how do you keep the lighting consistent from working from session to session? You know, if the model's coming back, you know, a week later and it's overcast versus, you know, when you start drawing sunny days, how do you adapt for lighting situations like that?
Yeah, well, it all depends. If you're lucky enough to have north light, you know, you don't have to worry about direct light, raking light. I don't have a north light studio. I have an eastern exposure. So I have Mylar screens that I put up over the windows, and it cuts down on the raking light. Now, it still raises the temperature of the color. So in the morning, the light is a little more yellow orange. And then when the sun's turned the corner of my house, it's cooler. So I'll tend to try to work only in the mornings or only in the afternoons with the same model on the same piece. You know, I might just if I have the model the whole day, I'll switch to a different piece in the afternoon. Yeah, if all of a sudden it's pouring rain and it's dark as hell, then I do something else. You know, then we draw or try out different poses, which is why a lot of people, you know, don't use, you know, natural light. They use artificial light that they can control every time exactly the same way. I understand the logic behind that, but I love daylight. You know, it falls very differently across objects than artificial light. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been an incredible morning. We look forward to hearing you more in October. Again, come visit us in October. The Stone Tower Studio, second floor, will have works you can see in person. And then again, Ephraim will be hosting a workshop on pastels.
And Jordan, how do people sign up for the workshop?
Well, nothing yet, because
Nothing
fall registration has not begun. So this is
Okay.
something you have to kind of keep on the back burner, and we'll let our community know when fall classes are available.
On your website.
But it should be, you should be able to register probably in July. So it'll a little bit of ways off. Of course, we have lots of classes in between. But thank you again to Ephraim. It's been absolutely
very much.
It's wonderful.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you for having me.
All right, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you all for coming.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.